Welcome back to the Imaginary Gallery. It is TJ, your host. Tonight's topic is twofold. It's actually an analysis of the covert narcissist, as well as a little discussion of their sense of entitlement and where it possibly might have come from. So we'll begin, and of course this probably applies to other personality disordered individuals as well, cluster B, but I chose covert because I have the most experience with that kind. First off, let's start with a history lesson, and for that I'll give you an analogy. So let's just say you've got two flower pots, flower pot 1 and flower pot 2. And in flower pot 1, you drop a seed in, which is some type of vegetable or some kind of plant, and you drop the same seed in flower pot 2. Well, these seeds represent people when they're first born. They're just a little baby, and they have to go through a process to grow and develop. Well, so in flower pot 1, we water it, we put it out in the sun, and it starts to do its thing that nature intends, where it starts to grow, and a little green piece sticks out. The sunlight nurtures it, and then we go to flower pot number 2, and you did the same thing, where you drop the seed in, and it's in the same sunlight with the water. However, flower pot 2 also had somebody pour some kind of poison into it, some kind of chemical that is not good for a seed to grow in. Well, we can compare this to a child who's born in a family without the abuse, without the narcissistic personality disorder influence, and that child is nurtured with the water it needs and the sunlight it needs, because the childhood years, face it, are the most important. And that's where you develop as a person. That's where you experiment this way and that way and learn this and learn that and figure, oh, that wasn't a good thing to do, oh, this was a good thing to do. And it's just a process, and it's very important for every individual. So minus all abuse, minus all trouble, the child is free to grow, or the seed is free to grow with the proper nourishment and sunlight, and it develops. Well, the flower pot 2, which will be your narcissist, covert, this one had that poison poured onto it. So the poison didn't kill it, but it did something to it, which would be the equivalent of a child growing up in some kind of family where it's devalued, or it's treated like trash, or something that shouldn't be done, that interferes in that beginning process of sprouting and starting to grow. So this is a very traumatic experience, and when you're an adult or a teen and you meet somebody who was the seed in flower pot 2, they're not going to usually tell you, oh yes, when I was in flower pot 2 I was poisoned. But no, you won't necessarily know. But that's all part of the whole deal here. Is this world's full of people. We've got plenty of flower pot 1s all over the place, and then we've got flower pot 2s, and they just missed something. They did not get the regular socialization process to work because of some traumatic experience or event, or neglect, or any number of things. The regular process just did not form. In fact, it was probably, instead of learning to be a fully functional, multidimensional human being, it was avoiding getting punished by whomever, or avoiding getting beaten by whomever. So there are two different levels of growth here. So what tends to happen, as far as what I've seen, is those in flower pot number 2 eventually age. I mean, you can't stop time. So sure, it's a baby with this void inside its head because it never had the chance to really develop as a fully functional human being that was really self-actualized and really knew what he or she was all about. It was more about survival, getting through the days and nights and avoiding trouble. So they never really got that as far as becoming a real person. So, of course, how does that manifest itself in adult life? Well, basically you've got a seed number 2 who's now a teenager looking around, seeing other seed walking around saying things that indicate they're really in touch with themselves. They're really intelligent as far as feelings and emotions. And then you've got yourself, if you're the number 2, you're seeing and witnessing and hearing things that just don't fit anything you know, because you shut down when you were just a tiny seed, and you've just learned to try to survive your way through, and so you realize that you are different. Well, that's what our narcissistic covert person is basically doing, but they'll never, of course, say it to you. They're going to mirror you or others to pretend to be just as normal as possible, but, of course, time tells us that there's nothing normal about it. But the deal with it is that I think, at least with the ones I've seen, they have some kind of hidden resentment because for whatever reason, whether it's their fault or not their fault, they did not develop properly, which when I say develop as far as the seeds go, well, the seeds in flower pot number 1 would grow correctly, which would be like a human being growing to learn a full range of emotions, such as empathy for others, sympathy, as well as compassion and caring for people in general, realizing they're just one of a huge ocean of people that are all connected, and looks for happiness and the better parts of life. Well, if you were in flower pot number 2, you have that's like a foreign language to you. In flower pot 2, you're just looking around at all these people around you, other human beings, behaving in ways you would never even think to behave in, and you probably feel like an outcast. So, of course, you're a human being that's growing and aging, so you eventually, as flower pot number 2 seed, would eventually decide, well, I want certain things. Well, it's much different than it is for the flower pot number 1 seeds. Those are just people who are self-actualized, who are looking to find a great place in the world. And then you've got this number 2 flower pot retarded seed that had poison or some kind of junk poured over it, so it didn't die, but it didn't grow properly. And it's like trying to find its way through this world and maybe finding you as a potential target, assuming you probably came from the flower pot number 1 type of situation. So you're perfect bait, perfect target. These creatures who were in the flower pot 2 had no choice but to grow up into adults, and if you are from flower pot 1 and you are like dating or involved or friends with a flower pot 2, you're going to find yourself confused because they're not real people. They never really developed. They don't have the regular emotions or the spectrum of emotions that people who were not in 2 but were in flower pot 1 have. So they spend a lot of their life watching, observing others, seeing what emotions present and what people say, and then mimicking that to their friends or acquaintances. So that brings us to how this relates to their sense of entitlement. These people begin their lives disadvantaged based on whatever circumstance occurred, and they're looking around themselves, seeing people developing in ways that they just are completely seeing as like a foreign language, but they notice that this is all around them, so they kind of feel cheated, like they did not get the proper process to develop as others to be like the way they are. And then they realize later to become a rebel, like, well, look at all these people with these sensitive feelings which I can't even seem to muster up. Look at these people telling on themselves when they've lied. I would never do that. And they become very manipulative because they learn that, well, they don't have the natural stuff other people have, but they still want things. So they've learned and skills of lying and deceiving and being phony and realizing that it pays off. So they just do it and do it and do it throughout their lives and as they're adults as well, and they're well practiced, because the people from Flowerpot 1, they may have also had a childhood with deception and manipulation and the usual, but because they have those extra dimensions that the narcissist that's covert does not have, they can self-reflect and say, oh, well, I did do that really selfish thing, but I shouldn't have, because now I understand the greater meaning. I'm going to change that. But see, the cluster B from Flowerpot 2 would never even experience such a thing. So to them, it's like, why is that person not taking all the food they did before? Why is that person not acting the way that I would act if I was in their situation? Well, because it's like a foreign language that the Flowerpot 2 just could never comprehend. So the best it can do is just accept that people are very different from me. However, I still want things from them, which means I will say the right thing to get the right result. And they feel entitled, which will come into another video that I've made some notes for about cause and effect, the relationship between cause and effect, because from my experience, the cluster B funk faces just don't have a clue. They do not get it, or if they do, we don't know about it, but relate to the sense of entitlement. Well, what I've noticed with many of the cluster B people I've come into contact with, they have this grandiose sense of entitlement, that they are like the center of the universe. And of course they don't usually say these things out loud to you, but when you step back and assess the entire situation, it kind of becomes obvious. Just for example, you're rich and people know it, and some clown comes up to you and starts talking to you and flirting with you. Well, you talk back and you interact with this person, which, I might add, is a cluster B predator who is simply looking at you as a big old dollar sign, period. But that's what you are. You're nothing but a dollar sign. So this clown is like flirting with you and going out of its way to see you and to make plans with you and all the things that they do. Well, like we talked about with the plants, with the Flowerpot 1 and 2, we're dealing strictly with the Flowerpot number 2, who is not a real human being, who is basically a monster out there trying to get whatever it can get, whether it should or shouldn't have it or not. And that's what goes on here. So the monster that you have met has begun the whole interaction with you false. It's phony. It is agenda-driven. And of course, you being this rich person, you're careful that you try to be careful and cautious because you know there are people out there who might want to take advantage of your riches. And yet here's this clown who's assuring you, oh, riches? I didn't even know you had any riches. I just love your face, or something. Well, the deal here is because they didn't develop regularly, they can do these undercover operations, and they don't seem to understand the concept of cause and effect. Because, face it, they're a phony. They're coming into your life pretending to like you to get your money. So if during this process you catch on to something that doesn't really sit or sound right, or after being told for weeks, I've never even looked at another person, and then to find out that actually it's got somebody else pregnant or something, it's kind of hard to take. Cognitive dissonance comes to mind. So when we're talking about this interaction, it's someone who doesn't have any, who never developed any sense of like the empathy or the compassion for others. And that's what makes it very easy for this clown to continue to pursue you. So this clown is feeling its way through, because remember, it didn't ever develop the way that others do, so it's learned and made its life basically a big theater show. Listening to people on television, watching other people in real life, watching movies and hearing different phrases being spoken that they themselves would never have anything inside them to conjure up any type of such a thought. So they're kind of like hit and miss by stealing lines from this situation or that situation, but not really understanding the whole picture. So when they try to pass themselves off as like a regular human, they kind of come across as a fool. But that's what happens here is, because a person from Flowerpot 1, for example, if they were watching in on the looking glass at this whole interaction, would say to themselves, that person's being deceptive to that person. I could never do that. But yet this monster is doing it in full force. Well, we know why. We're talking about that Flowerpot. And it feels that the whole world owes it. So it will do whatever it needs to do to get whatever it thinks it wants, whether or not it really deserves it or not.
Look, I would appreciate it if you would stop talking about things that you know nothing about. For your information, I have had 3 abortions, and I had to have them on very specific dates of the year because of some kind of numerology crap these fools follow. I didn't ask to understand, so give me a break. If you want a child, well, maybe you'll have one someday, but I fear my insides are probably rotten.
Hi. I am the narcopath, and I guarantee you, in the next 12 months, I'm gonna be the biggest star, 'cause I signed my name in blood. And I've donated 3 aborted fetuses to those sickos in the White House who want to eat their flesh. So, I paid my dues. So look for me on your news.
I know that you and I grew up in the same neighborhood, and I'm deeply sorry I never really talked to you, but could you do me a favor? I've applied to be on television, so if anyone asks you about me, would you please tell them that I am the nicest person you have ever met? And if you tell them that, I promise you, I will share some of the wealth that I gained from winning with you.
Tried to give it those free hay, and I said no. Yes, I've been bad, and I told him what, no.